Hello, everybody. Hi. This is Joel Clark here, lead designer of Tiansheng Lone Wolf Fists, and today I am in a good mood because we got a couple of days off for the holiday, and in addition to that, my Kickstarter is really wailing. We're up to almost $4,000. We've busted through our initial goal. Very happy with that. We nearly funded in the first day. We did fund within the first week, so that's really good. We've got back almost the same number. It was slightly lower, but almost the same number of people that pitched the original one, or funded the original one. So I'm really pleased. It shows that our audience has not shrunk, and we still have a lot of support from people. And there's enough potential for this game to really start taking off. It's a really good start. It's really encouraging. And considering how rocky this game has been development-wise over the last year and a half or so, it's really encouraging to know that there's still fans out there who are still really excited about it and who enjoy what we're doing and are enjoying the direction that we're taking it. But I say we a lot, even though I think a lot of people just kind of see me as the face of this thing, and they're like, oh, this guy's doing it all by himself. Nah. I co-design with David Ramirez, and we have a team consisting of me and him and Vic Andrade, and we have a lot of different artists that have a great vision that are helping us bring it to life, and it's all of them. All of them are contributing in their own way, and we're all contributing our own talents, so this is not a one-man operation by any stretch of the imagination. That being said, I've been given enormous creative leeway, and it's really allowed me to blossom as a designer and writer on this. I'm really, really thankful for the opportunity it's been. Anyway, so all of that. But today I actually didn't come to talk to you about that. I came to talk to you about what I've been working on the last couple of days, which is the faction lores for the different great clans in the setting. Because I've kind of and I do have a habit of doing this, where I've tied together the places that they are, like their territory, with the sort of socio-political reality of what these clans are and do, and how that influences the post-apocalyptic survivors in those territories, or rather, sometimes when it doesn't. So, that's been interesting. And the lores, as you all probably know at this point, are a functional replacement of the lore sheets from Legends of the Wulin and Weapons of the Gods, which were a fantastically interesting piece of rules tech. They were basically, and I've actually used this as the thesis for rewriting them, functional fluff. The idea was that you had setting elements, and that you as a GM or as a player could interact with these on a meta level. You could spend XP to bring stuff into the game and make it important. So, I'm not a big fan of using a meta resource to guide the direction of the content of the game. I feel like that's a little too metagamey for the kind of immersive style we're going for this time. On the other hand, I do like the idea a lot that a player can intuitively understand what the fluff is in terms of what shows up in the game. And I also like that a GM can use that in that sort of functional way. So going off of the idea of functional fluff, I had to ask myself, like, okay, what is the best analog for the new approach we're taking with Tiansheng to that same kind of combat system, that same kind of story framing device? What can we do with the lore sheet tech that doesn't completely abandon it, and indeed interprets it in a way that functions within this new kind of paradigm? And it's not really a new paradigm so much as it is like a super old school paradigm, but it's new in terms of it being introduced to this sort of different kind of design sensibilities. And understandably, there has to be a significant reinterpretation here. This is probably the point of greatest friction, aside from the imbalances, which were the other thing where I was really concerned about the tactical implications of an imbalance, where I think the previous games were more concerned with them as story elements. When you're designing a game, there's lots of different preconceived assumptions that you have the right and sort of the duty as a designer to challenge and question and see how they fit for the experience you're trying to craft. Now, Legends of the Woolen especially is a well-honed and well-crafted game that's based on like Forge-era design principles. It's almost what you might call a story game. I think it occupies an interesting interim space between a traditional role-playing game like Dungeons and Dragons and a pure narrative story game. It's a good example of a pure narrative story game, because actually, like, it's hard to think of one right off the top of my hand. Bluebeard's Bride, I guess? Like, there's quite a few of them. I haven't played a ton, and most of the ones that I play aren't pure story games. Because I think, again, I don't think there's a perfect example of a traditional versus a story game. Like, I don't think there's, like, an example of either. Because even if you dug down into, like, traditional games, there's a lot of missing elements in the initial drafts of D&D, and a lot of things that were abandoned or re-emphasized in later editions of D&D. So there's not, like, one D&D I can point to and say, oh, that's a traditional game. And similarly, with story games, there's not really, like, the perfect example of one. Because even games that are purely descriptive aren't necessarily narrative in structure. Like, the Amber Diceless role-playing game is not a narrative, it's a game. It's a game in which there are clear rules and there's task resolution and everything, but it's purely diceless. And it's the same way with a lot of games. And I think the line of delineation between these two things, it's what you can maybe understand to be the middle of these things, the point where as you go further this direction, it's a traditional game, and further this direction, it's a story game, is in how much the players have agency over the outcome of the game in terms of viewing it as a shaping narrative. So, like, what I mean by that is, like, the further you go away from that axiom, the closer you get to a game in which there is no assumption of story. It is merely what happens at the table. I'm an elf. The elf's name is, let's say, Bill. And Bill the elf wants to go into the dungeon. Alright, there's a monster at the door. I try to sneak around it. Roll to see if you sneak. Do you sneak? Do you not sneak? There's no point where Bill the elf, or the player of Bill the elf, can say, I think it would be more interesting to fail and for the monster to question me and get into a contest of riddles. That actually might be really interesting, but it won't be something that I have any say in as a player. The closest I get to a say is attempting to sneak, the dice then failing me of their own accord, and then trying to draw the monster into a game of deadly riddles. Now, those are things I can attempt to do within the context of actually attempting them as Bill the Elf, role-playing that character. But a story game takes a different approach. It's on the other side of that line, and it says, okay, you as an actor in this evolving story, you have direct control over the narrative of Bill the Elf, but you also have this broader control of the events surrounding him. So you can spend your narrative resource in more gamey styles of these things, or you can simply say that these things happen. And some games put it to a vote, some games have a narrative resource, like Nobilis, as I recall, has a resource you can spend, willpower, I want to say, that kind of changes how much say you have in your character and the story surrounding your character. And that broader meta control is something that is important to the story game design paradigm, because it's not assuming that you need to... Oh, my phone's all the way over there. It's not assuming that there's any... let me see. I'm not really sure how to characterize this, because this is a complex movement that happened in role-playing game design, and it branched off into its own kind of design paradigm. So I feel like it's a really important thing. Someone really wants to talk to me, by the way. It's a really important thing, but it's also something that's sort of hard to kind of put in a little box. But that's the basic line. We'll leave it at there for this little lecture. That's the basic line, is that there's a point on the continuum of traditional role-playing game to avant-garde story game where you make the decision that it's not just about players being in the box of the player and the GM like having the broader world and determining through their own judgment or through the mechanics of the rules how the events in that world unfold. There's a point where you stop that and you say, well, what if everyone had a more proactive, authorial kind of stance in that, and they had some ability to influence things like a writer would? And that whenever you cross that thin membrane, that invisible threshold, you go from a purely traditional game into a blended game that has story game elements, right? And vice versa. If you're playing a diceless game and you press past that membrane going to the other point on the other side, you're no longer playing a narrative game. What you're playing is a game that it has and I keep using the term traditional. Maybe I shouldn't. Maybe there should be a more concrete and specific term for it. But I think traditional is fine. Because it's the initial standing point. It does kind of, yeah. Anyway, so we'll just keep saying traditional. But there comes a point when you push past the other direction and you're playing a game that clearly has boundaries between what a character can do and what a player can do, and there's no assumption of authorial authority. So, Legends of the Wulin had pressed past it in this direction. And so did the previous game. Jenna Moran is a story game designer. She designed Nobilis and Jubos Mars Wolfscreaming Engine, most recently Glitch. And all of those games are well and far into the story game dimension. They assume that players are authors of a shared story. That's a part of their design. And there's an elegance to the simplicity with which she approaches that design. And that was present in the imbalances and secret arts in Weapons of the Gods, and it was more prevalent in Legends of the Wulin, where famously she talked to at least Eric, but I think Eric and Jerry, she both spoke to and kind of gave them an idea of her philosophy for design. And they really took her to heart, and they made it so that imbalances were more about the descriptive consequences than they were about the mechanical consequences necessarily, and they limited what the mechanical consequences of a given imbalance could be severely, which she did in Weapons, and they emphasized that the descriptive ones were actually something that you as a GM were expected to really play into as far as drawbacks. And that's baked into the bedrock of how all combat works, because the Lapse and Fear system requires constant action-by-action judgment from you as a GM about, does this qualify for a minor bonus or not? That's one of the things that hangs up that game and makes it very difficult to play, action-to-action, round-to-round, because there's so much resolution in a given round, and so many decision points, and so many points where you have to generate more results. And frustratingly, most of these things result in a steady state. They barely push back and forth as players jockey for advantage. And you need to put a lot of effort into each one of those jockeys to get to a steady state. It can be very frustrating as a play experience as a result. And further playtesting probably would have revealed that. And the other thing is online playtesting. If you play this game purely over Discord or chat rooms or whatever, that problem barely shows up. It's not noticeable because there's a completely different cadence to those kinds of games. So Legends of the Wulin is a game that's closer to the story game spectrum, but on the other hand, that doesn't seem to necessarily be a detriment in all circumstances. It actually is impressively robust, especially in a text-based role-playing experience. So, gotta give it props for that. But as a result of that, one of its most fascinating innovations, the lore sheets, it becomes something that's difficult to retranslate and push back across that membrane. Because a lore sheet directly says, here is a point in which players exercise authorial control. That's its function. Its specific design is, here's the story, and GMs can put this in the game, but players also have an ability to use a limited resource of experience points to reach in here, grab something, and then put it into the game. They can, for brief moments, act like a co-GM. And that is the design function of a lore sheet. And people love that. They went crazy for it. And I think the issue about why they went crazy for them might be interesting to examine. For a while, a lot of really good old GM advice and a lot of the techniques that was used to get the most out of old school games was not talked about. It was not something that was readily available online. There wasn't a movement of people that were remembering how to run games or innovating on the old style of running games, or people that were able to intelligently articulate the benefits of that old style, but there was a powerful negative pushback and an ignorance about how to do those things. And I know because it's the era I grew up in GMing. and there was no real discussion about agency for players in terms of like letting the dice kind of fall where they may, and there was no real discussion about playing to find out what happens, and there was no real way to make a non-railroad game. And so the knowledge of how to prep for role-playing games is all about writing out a story and having the players kind of hit the beats of that story, and whenever they didn't, you had to kind of herd them back into the funnel of your story so they could get the conclusion, which you wrote to be satisfying, of course. So the way in which you played games, the way in learning how to play games, there was terrible advice everywhere, and no one really understood how to do a hex crawl or a dungeon crawl or anything in a way that was fun and gave players a sense of authority about what decisions they were making, and allowed them to... Another thing that was missing lately online was the understanding that by saying your character did or tried to do something, it could happen in the world without any dice being involved. The skill system in the 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons really hurt our ability as players to understand that you don't need to roll to resolve certain things. If games like Amber Diceless had been more popular, we would have realized that being able to describe things carefully and completely was an element of playing Dungeons & Dragons skillfully, or really any role-playing game skillfully. But especially Dungeons & Dragons relied on you interacting with this described world the GM made, and that sort of made it real for the players in a way that the flat skill checks could not and did not. They actually actively harmed that dimension of role-playing games and made it so that people had the reality of how you interact with the role-playing game actively obscured and hidden from them. To this day, I encounter GMs in the wild who, when I tell them I'm attempting a very mundane task, like opening a door, will force me to roll dice and try to awkwardly shoehorn in some skill that would allow me to succeed at a task that no capable human being could possibly fail at. And it's really strange. And it's very artificial, and they really assume that this is how you are supposed to run a role-playing game. And it's awful. It's awful because it makes every single action answerable to the idiot god of the dice. And the dice need to be there, they do, and they need to generate dramatic moments, and they do, because whether or not I stab this goblin to death will determine if we have to fight a whole bunch of goblins as he raises the alarm, or whether we're able to sneak in and get the artifact that we need and leave before they all notice. That's real tension that's generated by the roll of a die, and it's important to roll that die. But there's a lot of mathematical reality to how dice roll. There's a very famous Justin Alexander article called Rolling to Failure, which examines the tendency of GMs to call for skill check after skill check instead of letting the first successful one ride through the scene every time any minor thing changes. And mathematically, that almost ensures that players will constantly fail. And I think that there's moments like that that remind me that there's just not been good advice for GMs in a lot of places. And to become a good GM, you really have to scour these internet articles and find the good advice and hold it up to your play experience and suss out what functions at a table and what doesn't. And there's really not one comprehensive guide anywhere that cleanly puts together the best advice and says, here is why these things work, here is why these other things don't work. The best resource is the Alexandrian, for the record. If I had to point to one website, one author, go to the Alexandrian. Read Justin Alexander and learn, you toe-headed morons. Anyway, got into a little bit of a rant there. But the point I was trying to make is people did not understand the validity and the desirability of the old school style at all. They had a lot of very bad assumptions and ideas and advice floating around, and it made it so that players felt that they lacked agency. Whenever you're in a situation where you can't describe yourself doing something mundane without risking failure, and you can't, like, all of the rules are based in your failure, you know? It's all about what happens when you don't succeed. A game like, say, Exalted makes you feel really empowered because there's no failure point in using a charm. With Exalted, you have available to you a resource, essence, and you have available to you a secondary resource, a charm. And when you combine the first and the second, it makes an effect in the world. And these effects are really encompassing and final in their language. They use the same kind of technique that letting it ride naturally adds into a game, which is to say that the success of one of these powers is complete, it doesn't come with any caveats, and it is persistent. If you use, I'm trying to struggle to remember any of the actual powers here. If you use Husband Seducing Demon Dance, which sounds sexual, but is really more about getting large crowds of people to do what you want them to do. You simply make the charm, you pay for the charm, and you make a speech in character, and everyone who hears it, more or less, becomes your minion. And that's it. There's no point of failure. You could never roll and fail on that charm. And there's no point where anyone can roll to succeed against it. They have preset numbers, and if your number is higher than theirs, and it always is, they are your minion. They don't get to have second thoughts. They're almost treated like robots. And the reason that White Wolf used that language was as a direct response to that sort of bad GMing style, where you could do, because you can do that exact thing, right, in any role-playing game. If you just use good GMing techniques, if your player talks and uses like a cogent and persuasive argument that would reasonably persuade a group of people, and they choose to follow through with whatever the thing that he's saying is, and you are consistent in that, then you've done the exact thing that Husband Seducing Demon Dance does with all that elaborate rules and language that forces it to happen. You've simply done it by being the sort of GM that allows it to happen within your game, and without in any way removing the challenge of the game or the difficulty or any of the things that make it realistic or reasonable. You've simply allowed the circumstance that is specifically enforced by that charm to naturally arise in your game. And almost every charm in Exalted is like that, where it's really clear in what it allows you to get. And I consistently saw, and still do see, people online saying, I feel like I can do this and the GM can't tell me no. And that tells me that these GMs are using that style, where they have a story and you have to go through the story. And that this charm, these powers, allow you to force that story off script in a way that they can't funnel you back. And so the GM now, in the power relationship of the person that is making you go through their little visual novel, their little shared storytelling novel that you only have one direction to go in, the power dynamic shifts, because you as a player now have the ability to determine what happens next, rather than the GM always finding a way to make your rolls not count, or make your actions irrelevant, or make everyone agree that this one funnel has to be the direction you go. That's a frustrating experience for a player, and powers like that and design like that is an answer to that frustration. It's really important to recognize that. So, okay. Lore sheets are another point where you as a player are getting the answer to that frustration, which comes at a very specific era and a very specific movement in GMing styles. Alright, so usually the players weren't really expected to read the entire rulebook, but they commonly did, because it's interesting to them. Of course, if you get a cool book like Legends of the Wulin, there's all kinds of nifty stuff in it. And the GM, again, is kind of assumed to be making a plot where there's beats and a story, and you are assumed to be moving through it. And so, again, you find yourself in a scenario where you don't necessarily have a guarantee of seeing what you want to see, or being what you want to be, or doing what you want to do. So the game goes out of its way to make certain to paint for the GM that you can't make certain things happen if the players are uncomfortable with it. A lot of Genomoran games are really specific in their language there too. And also, it specifically allows players, not GMs, the ability to reach into the fluff and scoop up something they like and make it important to the game as it's progressing. So this isn't so much a story game conceit when you think about it. When you think about it, what that actually is a guarantee, a meta and game level guarantee that players will be able to enforce their agency on the ongoing activity of playing this game, and they will be able to do that in a way that cannot then be no-sold by a GM. So really it's an answer to those two things. The first is the story-based prep structure, and the second is the tendency of GMs to funnel, because of that structure, to nerf and funnel player actions and attempts to get off of that structure back into it so that they have some kind of cohesive control for what happens next. We therefore conclude, and this should be a reasonable conclusion, I'm sure you guys saw this coming from a mile away, but we therefore conclude that if we abandon that story-based structure, we therefore should mitigate or destroy the problems it enforces. So let's say for a second, instead of having a story-based structure, you simply have a setting as big as Shenzhou, with all the stuff that's happening in Shenzhou there. And the way you run that setting is the players tell you where they want to go, and you see if they encounter something that gets in their way in the meantime. When they get there, you flip to that part of the book, you just read what's there, and you go from there. If you need an NPC, there's a chart to generate them. If you need something interesting happening, there's a chart to generate interesting charts. If you need more detail for the areas, they break it down into sub-areas that you can explore by just going from place to place. And you never have a really weighty reason to need to write something as turgid as a story, because you have a process that allows players to actually explore anything they want to that's already present in the setting. Suddenly, a lot of the structural blocks that necessitated that story-based structure, not knowing what was going to happen next, not knowing how to prep for something interesting, not having a description handy, not having an NPC handy, not having a plot ready, those kind of vanish, don't they? And so there's no real reason to have this scripted series of activities happen. And so a lot of the problems that go along with it are gone. I don't really have any reason to say no or to undermine the success of a player when they do something. If they start smashing through a building, say a tea house in a huge brawl with the local law enforcement, I don't have to then kind of reset that by having it fixed in the next scene, or having the law enforcement give them a slap on the wrist and then ignore them as though nothing had happened. I can actually have meaty consequences to that. I could put more powerful law enforcement officers there, or throw them in a dungeon they have to escape from. And I could have that tea house still smash by simply taking small notes and just moving on with the game. I can simply move them to the next part of wherever they're going and just have whatever happens there happen there. So there's no real need to no-sell what they're doing, and their actions naturally start to have a stickiness and a consequentiality to them. Also, I don't really need to stop them from any kind of conquest. There are already huge, powerful power players and extremely deadly and well-trained factions with several tiers of minion, ranging from like rank amateurs to extraordinarily deadly fighters in Shenzhou, in Legends of the Wulin, without me changing anything. And there's also a really easy way to give them all stats and names in that book. I'm not joking, it's really easy. So, I don't really need to do that story-based style, do I? So without needing to do a story-based style, the exercise of player agency becomes based on the capability of their avatars. So we know with a robust skill system like the effects charts in Tiansheng what the scale of their actions can be and what consequence that can have for their environment. And that's physical, social, and spiritual things, as well as intellectual things. So we already have a clear idea of the kind of range of influence they can have. And because of their combat, which is played like present in every game, we can understand like what they can, like the amount of people that they can reasonably threaten and what they can grant for them in the terms of like raw realpolitik. So once you've found player agency and player capability, again kind of doing something similar to what Exalted did, you don't really have the same need for lore sheets that you had before. There's no assumed return to a status quo, really. So, because the game has a robustness that allows you to play it, and because we've abandoned the story-based structure, the need or even the capability of reaching into different parts of the setting with a meta resource becomes diminished to the point of worthlessness. I don't really need to use my valuable experience points that I can use to learn more powerful kung fu techniques to make certain that the Thrashing Minister becomes important to the setting. I could simply go to Thrashing Minister as a character and make it important to the setting. I could even send one of my minions there if I wanted to get involved with something that was happening over there. I could have designed a character that was from Thrashing Minister in the first damn place. That's totally on the table. You know, there's no reason I can't make Thrashing Minister important to the ongoing campaign. If I liked it in the book and I want to interact with it, well, I can go and tour there as a super powerful kung fu demigod. So why would I use experience points to do that, when there's an alternative and considerably more efficient and satisfying way to do it? I wouldn't. The answer is the need for it vanishes entirely. There's no need to exercise player agency in that way, and with a meta resource that has better uses. I do think that tying your like the secondary use of lore sheets to sort of tie you into a place and create connections and a legend around your character, that's something I want to preserve. Because it doesn't actually take a meta resource to do, and it's more an explanation for how you naturally get drawn into the plots and intrigues of places as a power player that is influencing them. I do like that, and I think that as a meta concept, it works well because it's GM facing. The GM is the one that gives you experience points for your deeds, and the GM is the one that spends them on what you're getting entangled with. So I like that, and I think that preserving that might be a good, easy way to not only have a sense of continuity between the two different games, but also to take the best part, the most functional part of the idea, and bring it forward in a way that allows you to continue using it in this game. So I like that. But the other thing that I want to do with lores is just what I described. Make them functional fluff. So in other words, they are still performing the same need. They're simply doing it in a very different method. Whereas the other ones were a pure story that you as a player could spend experience points to make important to the story. In other words, have the GM write additional elements into their story script. This is giving the GM a robust enough set of functional fluff that's purely GM facing, that allows them to make it all available to you without any intercession in your part as a player outside of the natural playing of the game. And it preserves their ability for you as a player to read them and want to interact with them. Possibly more so, because instead of some vague, you'll make it important to the story, it's more concrete. I want to go to Heaven's Wheel because the 10,000 Death Manual is there. It's there. That's part of the fluff, and it's also part of the dungeon of Heaven's Wheel. At some point, if you go deep enough into Heaven's Wheel, you'll find that manual. So there's a more player gameplay version of wanting to interact with it. It's closer to reading a strategy guide than it is to looking behind the GM screen and saying, I want you to do this instead. So that's my current take on lores and interpreting them for this style. And I hope I've made it comprehensive enough to kind of demonstrate that I know what lores were for, and I understand what they were responding to, and I feel like we found a different way of filling the same need without really losing the function and the fun of them. I think a lot of people have been concerned with them, that I don't know what I'm talking about, or that I don't understand why they were good, or I'm throwing away something that they really loved in the game. But I'm really not. I promise you I'm not. This is just a different approach to the same ultimate end, and it does serve the same ultimate need, and it's just as satisfying in almost exactly the same way. So, I hope you've enjoyed this half hour of your lives. I really enjoyed ranting at you. Bye.